So, and talking about bike share design, I would now like to hand back to Max.
Thank you. So I'm now going to talk about personal safety and issues around digital inclusion. Obviously, the utility of a bike share service depends on its accessibility and the availability of the bikes. Therefore, the location where bikes can be picked up and returned is important. And our research showed that the factors that limit the amount people used or would use bike share varied quite a bit by gender. Of particular relevance is that females were more likely to select uncertainty over availability at the location I need it as limiting their use compared to males. And this was relevant for people who had used bike share and those who were considering using it. We can look at social conversion factors around gender to understand how power relations and social norms affect females' sense of fear in specific situations. We know that females are more at risk of unwanted attention when cycling in public, and that they feel more vulnerable in unfamiliar or unlit areas. Therefore, a female social conversion factor is low if consideration is not given to locating bikes in places deemed to be safe by females. More specifically, if bikes have to be taken to a specific location at the end of a journey, which requires the user to walk to their destination, consideration should be given to the safety of those locations and the routes to and from them. This implies that the environmental conversion factor could be increased for everyone through appropriate and safe location of the parking places, and that the social conversion factor could be increased by creating guidelines about location and developing transport policy that considers these safety concerns. So any barriers to taking up cycling via bike share could be reduced for deciders by ensuring that policy and provision focuses on the social as well as the environmental context. Another example is the geofence boundary, the area within which the bike share scheme operates. The creation and implementation of this virtual boundary has clear social implications for equitable access. The boundary itself changes the environmental conversion factor as it relates to the physical infrastructure of bike share provision as part of a transportation system. It can affect the lives of some residents of an area more than others. Those inside the geofence have a higher environmental conversion factor than those outside. Therefore, careful consideration should be given to the boundary of the area of operation in order to ensure that the scheme doesn't discriminate any sectors of the population based on class, race, gender, etc. Such discrimination might occur if the areas that fall outside of the area of operation are more ethnically diverse or are areas of higher deprivation or lower socioeconomic status. In Greater Manchester, Ordsall fell within the initial boundary but was removed in the final iteration of the scheme. This further disadvantaged an already socially disadvantaged population by removing access to a transport facility that enables healthy active transport decisions. It is essential, therefore, that policies that regulate the spatial distribution of bikes need to consider not only the environmental conversion factor, for example, the infrastructural provision, but whether they lower or raise the social conversion factor through active and considered social policies. Taken together with our previous point about gender and safety, policies that are actively and intentionally anti-discriminatory need to be formulated so that inadvertent discrimination does not occur. My next point highlights why digital inclusion is such an important consideration for equitable transport policy. Dockless schemes use a smartphone app with payment by credit or debit card. Some docked schemes use both card and cash payments. Our study found that some distinct differences in the acceptability of using various methods for finding and paying a bike were evident. We collected information about household income and found there's a relationship between income and the attractiveness of paying with a card. And additionally, age was a key factor in relation to limiting whether people would use bike share. 33% of over 65s said they didn't like using apps. This suggests that digital competence has an impact on personal conversion factors, especially in older age groups, and that in order to increase usage of bike share for older people who may be less technically savvy, alternative approaches may be needed. For example, upskilling in digital expertise could reduce the differential, but so too would ensuring there were alternative ways of accessing the bikes without a smartphone. We also asked people about using smartphones for access and payment. The top left image shows that having to use a smartphone to access a bike had no effect or increased the likelihood of using bike share for all our categories of users. However, if we are concerned with equitable provision, we need to focus elsewhere. 20% of abstainers, people who said they wouldn't use bike share, said that having to use a smartphone will make them less likely to use bike share. And more importantly, 19% of deciders would also be less likely, and this is the group who could be persuaded to cycle if things were provided in a way that they felt comfortable with. Now look at the deciders in the top right diagram. 42% would be more likely to use bike share if they could pay without a smartphone. Interestingly, in the bottom left image, 70% of deciders said that being able to use a smartphone to find a bike would make them more likely to use bike share. And this contradiction could be because they see the utility of the function, as only 6% of all respondents said that being able to use a smartphone to find a bike would make them less likely to use. So this function doesn't put people off, but when taken together with our findings in the top left image, we see that providing access with and without a smartphone may be needed to enable deciders to use bike share. In the bottom right image, we see that across all categories of user, only being able to pay by credit or debit card through a smartphone would have no effect for most respondents, but that 30% of deciders and 19% of users would be deterred from using bike share because of this. So I'm now going to pass on again to my colleague.
Brilliant, thanks Mags. I'm going to say a few words about bike design really. And I say a few words, there's probably an opportunity to say quite a lot of words about the design, but I'll try and keep it fairly brief. Obviously we were studying the Mobike scheme in Manchester. I believe Manchester was the first city in Europe to host the Mobike scheme, and we gathered a lot of interesting observations about people's perceptions and experiences of the bike design as a result of that. So it's obviously it's important first to say that this was the first generation of the bikes that were rolled out in Europe. It was the Mobike Generation 1, and they were subject to quite a lot of criticism really for offering a one-size-fits-all model, and with that approach we found through our study that we received quite a lot of interesting observations from people's experiences. It's also important to note that Mobike has since released a Generation 2 and I think maybe even a Generation 3 model of bike, and bike share schemes around the world are all offering different approaches to how you offer sort of a general cycling experience in a scheme. So I think the first thing to point out is that to a large degree size does matter when it comes to bike design. A lot of the common words from some of the interviews that I carried out as part of the study revealed that people's experiences of the bike tended to be around slow, bulky, heavy, frustrating to some people. And when I mentioned size matters, these bikes particularly were height dependent. I think if you were over 5'9", you weren't really able to fully extend your leg out. Your knees would always be bent while you were cycling, and as a result you couldn't really get any speed going because it was a single gear bike. And all of these points I think are important because they influence people's experience of cycling, potentially for the first time, or maybe for a long time, and it can contribute to how people feel on the road. And so a lot of the feedback we had was that the single gear bike, the heavy frame, the small sort of saddle extension meant that people couldn't fully extend their leg. They couldn't get up to speed. They couldn't keep up with traffic on the roads, and that led to feelings of vulnerability. As I mentioned, it's also important to consider that for some people, and what we hope bike share schemes can offer is this is the first experience of cycling for a lot of people, or maybe, you know, the first experience for a long time of trying cycling. And so it's important to remember that bike design has a huge influence on potentially how people go on to perceive what cycling means in the city. And as I mentioned earlier, these were the first generation of mobikes, and to Mobike's credit, they did take away a lot of the criticism and try to factor that into their following versions. But I think some of these factors are quite important to consider when looking at future schemes. So one of the this is a quote from one of the interviews we had, and it was really about an experienced cyclist who had spent many years in London cycling around those busy inner city streets, but then saying how when they translated that into getting on a mobike in Manchester, they suddenly found the cycling experience quite scary, and they felt quite vulnerable on the road. And they, as you can see, they asked the question like, why would you put yourself in that situation? Why would you do that? And this is someone who has several years of experience cycling in London. And so translating that to perhaps someone who's very new to cycling, how does that work? Does it offer them a window to a safe, healthy, enjoyable cycling experience, or is there still work to do in that sort of translation? The other point is that, as I mentioned, it's important to think about what that experience to newcomers is going to be like, and we have to find a way of supporting an accommodating cycling experience, and this definitely isn't easy. I think from a lot of the interviews that I carried out, some of the findings really came away is that if we're going to carry out these schemes in cities, which city centres, such as Manchester city centre, these places can be highly populated. There can be quite busy traffic moving frequently. There can be pedestrians crossing roads in all directions at some times. We have to make sure that the bike share scheme that we're offering is a blend of comfort, safety, speed and practicality, alongside all of the environmental conversion factors that Mags was referring to earlier, while they are all still in place and still accessible. Thinking a bit further about bike design, this is just a quote we had from the user talk about height. This person was 5'10" and felt that the frame was quite small for them. It was a high gear, and trying to pedal and keep up with traffic was a challenge for them. But it's not all bad, it's not all negative. This was a comment from an interviewee, interestingly a female interviewee, that said that she found the bike really easy to use, to ride because of the big saddle, and that the luggage racks at the front were practical for inner city travel, putting your shopping bags in and maybe jumping on a bike on the way back from the shops with groceries and getting home safely with that. So that's also something to think about, that practicality element. We're offering a travel experience and a mode of transport, but then there also can be a practicality aspect attached to that when we're thinking about urban uses. So as I said, it's not all negative. Big saddles are comfortable to ride, and the basket has been praised. The basket was praised for practical tasks. The weight, while can be problematic, also means that it can lead to a smooth rolling experience on the ground, providing that you don't have to go up a hill. And yeah, to some people, slow can mean steady and safe. For some people, not being able to pick up a speed meant they felt vulnerable on the roads because they couldn't keep up with traffic. But for other people, being able to go slow and not worry about the bike gathering a lot of speed meant that they always felt in control of the vehicle. So again, that's two very different experiences on the bike, but also two very valid experiences. And so it's important to try and find a way of balancing those. And I think that's an important consideration, again, for people who might be trying cycling for the first time. So that's what I have to say on bike design, and I'm going to pass this back over to my colleague.